Late February 1945, Lower Saxony, Germany. The snow hides the blood, but not the footprints. Along a cracked village road, a column of German POWs shuffles forward under the watchful rifles of British soldiers. Their boots grind through slush and ashes from burnt-out homes. Silence clings to the morning, broken only by the hollow command, "Keep moving." Among them is Oscar, gaunt from months at the front, coat torn, fingers trembling against the cold. His helmet is gone, his dignity slipping away with every step. He turns his head, just once, and sees her. Anna, his wife, stands near the ruins of their house, clutching her coat shut against the wind. Her breath shakes as she whispers his name, too soft for anyone but him to hear. Their eyes lock. 1 second, 1 lifetime. She takes a single step forward, but the muzzle of a gun blocks her path. Oscar raises his hand as if he could touch her one last time. But the line moves on, and Anna's world moves with it, into a new war she must fight alone. By 1943, the war that once filled Germany with defiant pride had begun to bleed it dry. The Eastern Front consumed entire divisions in a matter of weeks. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to fire-lit skeletons under British and American bombing. And in quiet towns like Anna's, the absence of fathers, brothers, and husbands became a constant ache. Every day, more uniforms disappeared into trains heading either east into the snow or west toward the advancing Allies. Many never returned. The German government rarely spoke of casualties, but the truth grew louder with every unopened letter and every black-ribboned announcement nailed to church doors. More than 1 million women would become widows before the war's end. For others, their loved ones were neither alive nor dead, only lost. Oscar had joined the Wehrmacht not out of ideology, but out of duty to protect Anna, their farm, the little future they had planned. But duty did not protect him from reality. By late 1944, British forces had broken through the Siegfried Line. German infantry units, once so sure of victory, found themselves exhausted, underfed, and outmaneuvered. Whole battalions were captured in hours. Those who surrendered or were taken prisoner entered another kind of uncertainty. British field commanders followed the Geneva Convention, registering prisoners through the International Red Cross. In theory, families could receive notice that a soldier was alive, being held in a camp, and even allowed to send letters or small parcels. But war made theory fragile. Paperwork burned. Mail routes collapsed. Anna waited for weeks, staring at the gate each morning for a uniform that never came. Rumors filled the silence. Some said British camps were humane, even clean. Others swore that captives were starved or shipped away to labor forever overseas. Most families learned to fear good news as much as bad, because a living prisoner still meant a stolen life, stolen years, stolen memories, stolen touch. For Anna, every sunrise was a question. Is he alive? Is he suffering? Does he still remember me? Germany itself seemed to ask similar questions of fate. Young boys in Hitler Youth uniforms were being handed rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Roads flooded with refugees, the elderly pushing carts, children dragging blankets. The Reich had taught its people to fear surrender more than death. Yet surrender was becoming unavoidable. And so, with the Allies closing in and the German army unraveling, the fate of captured soldiers, like Oscar, shifted into British hands. They would be marched away from battlefields and broken cities toward camps far beyond German borders. There, new stories would begin. Stories built from fences, hope, and unexpected human connection. By early 1945, more than 350,000 German prisoners of war were held across Britain. Camps appeared everywhere. Old airfields, unused farmland, even repurposed estates with wooden barracks laid out in orderly rows. Barbed wire encircled them, but what happened inside was far different from the nightmares German propaganda had painted. Under the Geneva Convention, Prisoners were given adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They kept rank hierarchies, saluted officers, and received pay for labor. Many were assigned to farms or workshops, helping replace British men still fighting overseas. The work was hard, but it gave purpose. The guards were strict, but rarely cruel, and the world inside the fence slowly grew human. Some German soldiers, young men far from home, found unexpected relief in the calm routines of rural England. They witnessed small acts of kindness that challenged everything they'd been told. A guard sharing cigarettes, a farm wife leaving extra bread at the field's edge, children asking them to fix toys. Enemy became a fragile word. Walls built on fear began to show cracks of curiosity. Farmers learned names. Prisoners learned English. Sometimes laughter slipped past the barbed wire before anyone could stop it. But the separation from home was a wound that never closed. Prisoners waited desperately for Red Cross messages. Thin, fragile letters that carried the weight of entire futures. If those letters stopped, days became shadows of loss. Many widows back in Germany still didn't know whether their husbands lived behind wire or lay beneath foreign soil. Inside the camps, men clung to memories. They carved wooden keepsakes, flowers, hearts, initials, gifts they dreamed of delivering when the war ended. They exchanged stories of wives left behind, including Anna's name, whispered in Oscar's prayers before sleep. British military chaplains sometimes encouraged prisoners to attend local church services, believing faith could calm hostility. Those short walks outside the fences brought prisoners into quiet, cautious contact with civilians. Some women looked upon these men not as symbols of terror, but as husbands and sons far from home. Humanity was resurfacing, slowly, bravely, yet every relationship, every exchanged glance, lived under the threat of punishment. Guards reminded everyone, the war isn't over. Hearts could not be allowed to forget the barbed wire. Still, a truth was growing stronger than commands. The farther the war drifted away, the closer people became. This would be the world into which Anna and Oscar's story, their desperate separation and fragile hope, would continue. Next, we step deeper into the heart of this documentary, exploring the angles, the moral, emotional, and tactical dimensions of these forbidden human connections. War did not end for Anna when the front collapsed. It simply moved into her home, into the quiet places grief chose to live. She slept on one side of the bed, leaving room for a man who might never return. Every object became a reminder. His coat on the hook, the dent in his pillow, the wedding ring she twisted between trembling fingers. Millions of women across Germany shared this silent war. The world saw them as symbols of sacrifice, but each was merely a person waiting for one heartbeat to come home. Loneliness turned seconds into hours. Grief turned hours into years. Propaganda had insisted the British were monsters, destroyers of homes, threats to everything German. But for Anna, the propaganda posters meant nothing compared to the empty chair at her table. Meanwhile, across the channel, Oscar woke each morning inside wire. He saw England not through hatred, but through longing. The voices around him spoke a language he could not yet understand, and yet the meaning was clear. You are far from everything you love. Even surrounded by hundreds of men, he was alone. War created enemies by command. Loneliness reminded them they were human. Across Britain, the curious reality took shape. The enemy had eyes that filled with tears and hands that shook when writing home. British civilians, once warned to fear these men, began to notice the softness beneath the uniform. A thank you gesture, a shy smile, a voice cracking when asked if he had a family. And then the true conflict emerged. Not armies against armies, but humanity against hatred. Women who had lost their own loved ones looked at these captured soldiers and saw reflections of absence. Their grief overlapped in the air between them, making empathy almost inevitable. Yet empathy was dangerous. British law allowed POW labor, but no personal contact outside necessity. Gestures of kindness could draw suspicion. A friendly word could be written up. A bond, anything resembling trust, was considered betrayal or worse, romance. But the heart is indifferent to borders, uniforms, and walls. It notices only warmth, only need. Women like Anna, left behind in shattered towns, and men, like Oscar, fenced off in foreign fields, were not thinking in terms of flags or victory. They were just trying to survive each day without losing hope. And hope is always searching for a place to land. Their stories, whispered into the cracks of wartime, set the stage for the most complicated angle of this history. For the British soldiers, who guarded the German prisoners, duty was clear. Obey orders, maintain distance, never sympathize. Yet the longer the war dragged on, the harder that rule became to follow. The men behind the barbed wire were not the monsters of propaganda reels. They were farmers, mechanics, students, young, hungry, homesick. A guard in Yorkshire once wrote in his diary, "They look like us. They talk about their mothers and the cold. They're not the war. They're what's left of it." Britain in 1944 was tired. Cities still bore the scars of the Blitz, and every village had empty chairs at dinner tables. When captured Germans were assigned to farms and factories under the Geneva Convention, something unexpected happened. The enemy began helping rebuild what the war had broken. They worked side by side with locals. Some sang German folk songs as they mended fences or harvested wheat. Children, too young to understand hatred, waved at them across fields. Slowly, walls that years of fighting had built began to crack. But inside those cracks grew something delicate. Understanding. Sometimes even affection. It was not love in the grand romantic sense, at least not at first. It began with shared humanity. A British widow offering tea to the prisoner who carried her firewood. A letter smuggled through a sympathetic guard. A glance too long to be dismissed as politeness. For officers, such interactions were a moral nightmare. The rules were explicit. No fraternization. Any hint of personal connection between British civilians and German POWs was considered unpatriotic, even treacherous. Yet, human nature rarely obeys official policy. The heart, in wartime, becomes an act of rebellion. For many British soldiers, especially those who had seen combat, hatred was exhausting. Some had faced the Wehrmacht firsthand and knew the cost on both sides. They no longer wanted to fight men who were already beaten. So, a quiet empathy grew, unspoken, discreet, and dangerous. Behind fences, kindness began to replace suspicion. Guards slipped extra bread to sick prisoners. Farmers spoke of the good German lad who worked harder than any hired man. In some rare cases, forbidden correspondence developed into friendship, and even love. Censors intercepted many letters, their contents sealed forever in military archives. But enough survived to reveal a powerful truth. In the shadow of destruction, people still reached out for connection. It was this fragile human defiance, kindness where there should have been cruelty, that shaped the heart of the story to come. Because one woman's quiet compassion and one prisoner's longing to be remembered would soon cross every line drawn by war, and in doing so, they would redefine what it meant to be enemy, and what it meant to be human. The weeks after Oscar's capture passed like winter shadows, long, silent, without warmth. Anna did not know whether he lived. She rationed food, searched for lost neighbors, and tried to rebuild life from the ruins left behind. But each night, the same nightmare returned. The look in his eyes as he was marched away. Across the sea, Oscar labored on a British farm not far from the camp, repairing fences, harvesting potatoes, carrying sacks of grain until his back ached. The rhythm numbed his fear, but never his longing. He wrote letters every month. Short, hopeful lines sent through the Red Cross. Messages like lifelines thrown into a black ocean. For months, no reply came. Then one morning, in late spring of 1945, the camp mail clerk called his number. A single folded message, stamped, worn, and trembling in Oscar's hands. It was her handwriting. She had found the courage to write. She told him that the village still stood, that she was alive, that she had waited every day for news, and that she had seen him taken from her. She wrote the words she had not been able to shout. "Don't leave me, Oscar. I will wait for you. Come home to me." Oscar hid the paper like a sacred relic, reading it each night beneath the thin wool blanket. The guards noticed the change in him. A quiet, burning determination replacing the hollow stare he once wore. But then came the complication. British military authorities began planning for repatriation. Men who had families were to be reviewed first. A slow, bureaucratic process burdened with political caution. Germany was collapsing into occupation zones, and many POWs feared their return would bring suspicion, not welcome. Meanwhile, Oscar had been assigned more frequently to the farm. The farmer's wife, Mrs. Bennet, saw the tenderness in his eyes when he read the letter. She asked softly, "Your wife?" Oscar only nodded and looked toward the horizon, toward home. Mrs. Bennet, a widow herself, understood separation. She pressed a second envelope into his hand, paper and a pencil inside. "No one deserves silence," she said. Rules were strict. Unauthorized correspondence was forbidden. But human compassion ignored regulations. He wrote again, longer this time. He thanked Anna for waiting and promised that the war could end, but not them. He slipped the letter into the trusting hands of Mrs. Bennet, who mailed it without hesitation. A few days later, Oscar was working near the edge of the property when he saw something that stole his breath. A line of civilians visiting the town nearby, and Anna's familiar silhouette among them. Her eyes widened. His heart stopped. They stood only meters apart, separated by fences, guards, and laws, yet closer than they had been in months. This was the moment that would decide everything. The moment when love confronted duty, fences confronted longing, and two wounded hearts were forced to choose. The cold morning air held a strange stillness, as if time itself hesitated. Wrapped in a coat too thin for the English winter, Anna stood at the edge of the camp's outer fence, a place she wasn't supposed to be. But she had learned the rhythms of this place now, the gap between patrols, the kindness in certain guards' eyes, especially Sergeant Miller's. He pretended not to see her as he turned his back and walked a little slower than usual. Beyond the fence, lines of POWs prepared for transfer to another camp farther north. Rumors whispered of harsher work details, of less mail getting through. And among them, Wilhelm, her Wilhelm, changed, thinner but unmistakably him. That familiar posture, the way he scanned faces with desperate hope. Anna stepped closer. Her breath trembled against the wire mesh. Wilhelm saw her. For a heartbeat, the war disappeared. He broke formation, earning a sharp shout from a British corporal. But Miller intervened with a calming gesture, just enough delay to allow the impossible moment to exist. They didn't touch. Barbed wire made sure of that. But their eyes held the entire world they once shared. "I'm still here," she whispered, voice cracking. His lips formed silent words. "Ich liebe dich. I love you." She reached into her coat and pressed a folded letter through a gap in the fence, the one she'd rewritten a dozen times, hoping the Red Cross wouldn't censor the emotion in its lines. Wilhelm took it with shaking fingers, his gloves thin and torn. In return, he slipped a small wooden carving into her hand. A figure of a bird, wings spread, whittled from scrap. Freedom he could not have, so he carved it into what he could give. Footsteps marched closer. Orders barked. The line began to move. Panic surged in Anna's chest. "When will I see you?" she asked, a question with no possible answer. He hesitated, then forced a soft, strained smile, the kind a soldier wears when trying to protect someone from the truth. "Survive," he said, barely audible. "For us. For when the world isn't like this anymore." She gripped the wire until it cut through her gloves. "I'll wait," she breathed. Wilhelm nodded once, a soldier's promise, and turned back into line. As the column marched away, snow began to fall again. Light flakes drifting, melting instantly upon the warm salt of her tears. Anna held the carved bird to her chest, feeling the shape of its wings, as if they could keep her afloat above the grief. No grand rescue, no stolen escape, just two human hearts in a war determined to crush them. His last whispered words lingered in the frozen air. Survive, and then he was gone. Peace, when it finally came in 1945, did not look like victory to most Germans. It looked like rubble. Cities ground into dust, millions displaced, and countless families torn apart by uncertainty. For the thousands of German POWs held across Britain, the war's end was not the end of captivity. A new political reality emerged. Germany needed to be rebuilt, and men like Wilhelm became laborers in a country that had once been their enemy. Repatriation was delayed. Months stretched into years. Many soldiers did not return home until late 1946 or even 1948, depending on their assigned labor groups. They worked on farms, in factories, repairing war-damaged infrastructure, rebuilding a nation not their own. Some British farmers treated them fairly. Others took advantage of the cheap, regulated labor. Trauma did not announce itself loudly, but it lingered in every quiet night behind barbed wire. Letters traveled, slowly, often censored. Some wives continued writing until their hands ached. Others remarried under pressure from families or because they could not endure the silence anymore. And when husbands finally returned home, they sometimes found strangers waiting in their own houses. Children grown up without them. Wives hardened by survival. Marriages legally intact but emotionally shattered. In Britain, too, lives shifted. POWs formed friendships, fragile but real, with guards, farmers, and civilians who taught them English, shared cigarettes, and, sometimes, hearts. These forbidden bonds tested the boundaries of law and loyalty. When the time for repatriation came, those connections were ripped apart without negotiation. Wilhelm would have been among the masses processed at makeshift depots, numbered, inspected, relieved of British-issued belongings, given a meager kit for the journey home. The train that carried him eastward was filled with faces both hopeful and terrified. They did not know whether they were returning to family, to ruins, or to graves. Post-war Germany was a land of ghosts. Young widows waited in lines to register missing husbands, clutching photographs and scraps of paper. Children asked questions with no answers. The once proud Wehrmacht soldier now stood in bread queues with civilians, wearing worn-out clothes, head lowered. The emotional landscape was unfamiliar. No marching bands, no propaganda speeches, just silence and the ache of consequence. Some POWs never emotionally returned. Nightmares chased them for decades. Guilt carved itself into their voices. Others tried to rebuild, working humble jobs, marrying, having children, carrying unspoken pasts inside them like locked boxes. War had rewritten their futures. It was not just cities that had been destroyed, but the continuity of human lives, derailed and rewritten by history's violent hand. Their most intimate battles began only after the guns went quiet. For Anna, peace arrived as a hollow word. The war that had swallowed her marriage ended, but it returned nothing she had lost. The house she once shared with Wilhelm had cracked walls and an empty chair at the table. The familiar country road now led only to memories she could barely bear to revisit. She became part of a silent generation of women, Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, clearing the ruins of Germany brick by brick. Their grief was never paused for mourning. Every stone they lifted reminded them of the world that had fallen. The war had forced them to become stronger than they ever wished to be. Her days were filled with rebuilding, sorting debris, scavenging wood for heating, searching ration lines for flour. But her nights belonged to what could not be spoken. She would sit beside the window, tracing the outline of the horizon, imagining a man behind barbed wire in a distant land, still wearing his wedding ring. The memory of Wilhelm marching away in the snow tormented her, because that day she had not known it was a goodbye. When news finally came that POWs were returning, hope arrived like a storm she could not control. She waited at the train station among crowds, clutching a photograph that had faded from the warmth of her hands. Every train that hissed into the platform carried faces like Wilhelm's, tired, gaunt, changed. But not his, not that day, not the next, not ever. Records would later show he succumbed to illness in a camp hospital. Properly buried, the British noted, but that detail brought no comfort. To Anna, he remained somewhere between here and gone, a love unfinished, trapped in the moment their eyes last met. She never remarried. She continued working, teaching others that survival was its own kind of courage. She kept Wilhelm's letters, the ones she managed to send, the few she received, tied in a ribbon inside a wooden box. She would read them only rarely, because each word reminded her of two wars, the one nations fought and the one the heart endured alone. History often speaks of armies, treaties, and borders, but peace is built just as much on the quiet strength of people like Anna, widows who carried the burden of love that war could not return. Her story, and thousands like it, softened the walls between former enemies. The British soldiers who guarded men like Wilhelm became fathers and grandfathers, who taught future generations that humanity can rise even from the ashes of conflict. Anna lived long enough to see Europe rebuilt, united in ways that once seemed impossible. But she always carried one memory untouched: snow falling, boots marching, a single glance that held a lifetime. The war ended, but the heart never forgot. History often remembers the great battles, the generals, the borders redrawn by force. But what lingers in the quiet places between dates and statistics are stories like theirs. War created enemies where none truly existed. It took two human beings, a young widow and a captured soldier, and placed them on opposite sides of a line neither of them chose. They were meant to fear each other. Instead, they recognized the familiar: loneliness, uncertainty, and the fragile desire to hold on to something good, even for one stolen moment. Wilhelm returned to a country he barely recognized, carrying the memory of a woman who had given him more than comfort. She had given him belief that kindness still survived amid a world of barbed wire and suspicion. And Anna, who would rebuild her life among ruins, never spoke of that winter day. But she kept that slip of frozen paper as proof that love is not defeated by uniforms. War Frenchin. Maps stabilize. Alliances shift. Yet the small acts of courage, choosing to see another's humanity, become the foundation of peace that follows. In the fading gray of a winter evening, she once stood by a roadside and watched him disappear into the snow. She could not call after him, nor step forward, but in her heart, one promise remained. Not even war can tell me whom I am allowed to care for. And somewhere, beyond the silence of history, a lost voice answers, "Don't leave me. Remember me."